other countries in the region may follow suit soon. The UAE and Bahrain join Egypt and Jordan as the only Arab countries to have full diplomatic relations with Israel. Behnam Ben Taleblu, senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, joins us to bring us more context. It's great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time. First, can you explain for us the role that Iran played in the UAE's and Bahrain's decision to agree to these deals and some of the other factors that drove the agreements today?
Well, great to be with you, Lauren. In many ways, Iran was the 800-pound gorilla in the room, or should I say, at the White House lawn during the signing ceremony today, because Israel and some of the Arab states of the Persian Gulf have had discrete or more covert ties, particularly in the security realm, for about a decade now. This stuff has been widely reported and never been knocked down out of this wide reporting. But as the Iran threat grew, the imperative to publicize some of these ties as a deterrent to Iran, as well as a representative of a massive realignment of interests and values in the modern Middle East, is a critical driver, if not the main driver, of this accord between Israel and the UAE, and the quick follow-on between Bahrain and Israel right after the UAE deal. One need only compare the length of time between Egypt and Jordan, as well as Jordan and the UAE versus the UAE and Bahrain's deals, to realize this could be a new wave of potential normalization for political and security purposes, not to mention the overriding economic and technical reasons to want to have good relations with a country like Israel that's called the Silicon Valley of the Middle East.
Sure. 26 years since Jordan agreed to formalize ties with Israel. So do you anticipate more Arab nations will establish ties with Israel? And if so, which ones should we be looking for?
I do. I would keep my eyes on the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, perhaps Oman, perhaps some of the other monarchies like Morocco, for instance. There was, again, talk of Sudan. The real key here is not to look at this by ethnicity or sect anymore, but rather by being a status quo or anti-status quo actor. It's funny that Turkey and Iran, two non-Arab countries, have been some of the biggest detractors of Arab-Israeli peace in recent days. The ironic historical twist here, when you add in this national element, is that Turkey and Iran are non-Arab, but they're Muslim-majority countries. More than half a century ago, Turkey under a different government and Iran under a drastically different government were the first Muslim-majority countries to reach out and de facto for Iran and de jure for Turkey recognize Israel and establish relations with the Jewish state. Today, it's a 180-degree opposite.
This is why I'm so glad we have you on, to give us all of this context and the history behind all of this. Israel has said it's pausing its plans to annex parts of the West Bank. Palestinians oppose these deals signed today. I believe the Prime Minister said it meant that the Arab peace initiative was dead. Will this change anything in efforts to secure a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians?
Well, there's a couple of things that this does change, but I'm glad you mentioned the Palestinians here, because people have said that these agreements between the UAE and Bahrain have removed the Palestinians from the equation. But when you look at the trend of normalization, or the trend of talks, starting back with Egypt's President Sadat, who was assassinated after his peace agreement with Egypt, he opted for a national approach when he couldn't include the Palestinians into larger talks with the Israelis back in the late 70s, early 1980s. This approach of trying to put the national interest of the country that the president or whomever he represents first is the approach that was followed by the Gulf states. So it's not that the Palestinians have been marginalized. It's that these are countries, for foreign policy purposes, putting their foreign and security policy, for lack of a better word, first when it comes to diplomatic prerogatives with Israel. This means that in the medium to long term, we shouldn't be looking at this conflict as an Arab-Israeli conflict. We should be looking at the settlement issues, at the West Bank, the future of the PA, as an Israeli-Palestinian issue, and really disaggregate and separate out the Israeli-Arab conflict from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's the direction we're headed in.
Behnam Ben Taleblu, thank you so much. I'm just so glad you were able to join us and help us better understand these historic deals that we saw on the White House South Lawn today. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lauren. A pleasure.
And in more stories, we're